we could hear him.
There were some abandoned buildings that feel like they were always meant to end up abandoned. Factories, warehouses, outlets, and some retail spaces. Places that are built first and foremost for utility. Places whose disappearance feels almost built into their design. But theaters are different in a weird way. Theaters aren't just buildings where people gather. They're built to direct and hold attention. To gather strangers in the dark, point them all in the same direction, and ask them for an hour or two to give themselves over to the same story. They're places designed to organize fantasy, to hold projection in every sense of the word. Film projected onto a screen, emotion projected into characters, and meaning projected into shared experience. And when a place like that goes dark, it's not just the building that risks disappearing, but the layers of memory and ritual that are packed inside it. In this video, we explored the Garden Oaks Theater, a post-war neighborhood movie house in Houston, Texas that opened in 1947, survived decades of changing movie culture, and spent its final active years not as a cinema, but as a Protestant church. At the time of filming, nearly 80 years after it first opened, it sits under threat of demolition, suspended in a strange place between still being remembered and becoming only a memory.
For around $7 million last October. That's according to Harris County property records.
The Garden Oaks Theater opened on July 10, 1947, developed by Interstate Theaters and designed by the Dallas architectural firm Pettigrew and Worley. It was never meant to be one of Houston's giant downtown movie palaces, but was designed as a neighborhood theater, a local movie house with a single screen woven into the ordinary life of a rapidly expanding post-war Houston. The sources I found differed on the exact seating capacity, placing it around 700 to 1,000, but most agree it was a substantial sub-run house, meaning that films typically arrived here after their first-run engagement in larger theaters. Its opening feature was The Sea of Grass, released that same year and starring Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. Even in its design, the theater reflected the era's optimism and confidence. Its exterior was built in a streamlined post-war style, with vertical signage and a marquee that gave it the crisp geometry of a mid-century neighborhood landmark. Inside, the theater featured terrazzo floors, decorative railing, indirect lighting, and the sort of small luxuries that made even waiting in the lobby feel like part of the experience. Places like this weren't simply for entertainment. They were built to make the experience of going out feel elevated and ceremonial, and worth remembering. But, like so many neighborhood theaters, Garden Oaks couldn't remain untouched by the cultural and economic changes that reshaped American moviegoing in the second half of the 20th century. By the 1970s and 1980s, the theater was already well past its original glory days. ABC Interstate sold the property to Al Zerzana, who had actually worked at the theater as an usher in the 1950s. Under his ownership, the theater entered a prolonged state of attempted survival. Zarzana would later describe how changing neighborhood conditions, rising financial strain, and the broader decline of single-screen theaters forced the Garden Oaks to adapt. It began operating as a discount dollar theater, and later leaned more heavily into Spanish-language showings exclusively as Houston's demographics shifted. At the same time, the rise of the megaplex was changing the movie business altogether. As multi-screen theaters began to dominate the industry, single-screen houses like Garden Oaks were pushed closer and closer to extinction. The economics no longer favored neighborhood movie places, no matter how much history or character they carried. By the early 1990s, the situation had further deteriorated. Ongoing road construction along North Shepherd Drive made access to the theater inconvenient or nearly impossible for its already shrunken customer base. And by 1994, the Garden Oaks Theater closed permanently, ending its near half-century run.
It's like flooded. When you get in there with your light,
Oh, yuck.
still water. It's so beautiful. Shit looks like a dungeon.
Yeah.
This was the projection room.
Yeah. What is that?
Sounds like a faucet could be on again or something. There was some kind of squelching noise up there. That's the bathroom. Someone's actually used it. This door over here seems locked. Oh, I'm just tripping. I was trying to put it
Almost immediately after closing, the theater began a second life as a place of worship for Protestant services. A Spanish-speaking church first leased the theater, and it passed hands through several different congregations, such as the Evangelistic Temple or the Net Church, before finally becoming home to Grace Church in 2008. Grace continued using the building for worship until 2025, when the congregation moved to a new location, leaving the Garden Oaks Theater truly abandoned for the first time in its nearly 80-year history.
Gonna get some kind of lung infection breathing in that floor.
My lung.
In October of 2025, Grace sold the theater for $7.1 million. By early 2026, groups like Preservation Houston and Art House Houston had begun advocating publicly for the site's preservation as demolition became the site's default fate. At the time of filming, these two groups are attempting to raise enough money to purchase the theater back from the developers at the same price Grace sold it. They were only given a short 90-day window during which to do so. While generous investors helped them make a good faith deposit and open the door for the purchase to go through, the opportunity to raise the funds and save the theater is rapidly narrowing. And maybe that's the real story here. The Garden Oaks Theater isn't just an abandoned theater. It's the remains of a place once built to gather people into a common act of attention. Even before it became a church, it served as a kind of ritual site, a place where people came to orient themselves towards something larger than the self through a shared emotional experience. Even though it's abandoned, it still draws people in. Photographers and urbexers become its final witnesses, documenting what remains and giving the building one last audience. Even though it's dead, it lives. Even in ruin, it continues to participate in the same mythic patterns it once displayed on its screen, a place for turning chaos into order, if you'll pay attention to what it's showing you. And for now at least, it's still there, still sitting dark and empty on North Shepherd, still holding the outline of everything it once contained.